concept in anthropology and some other sciences now, but it started in anthropology, and it talks about the threshold that occurs. Originally they were talking about the one that occurs in the middle of rituals, usually a ritual from one part of life to another. It's that time in the middle when things are disconnected and disorganized and confusing, so that whoever's going through this time is no longer in their pre-ritual state, and they're not what they're going to be at the end. They're in this liminal stage, the in-between stage. Some people call it the threshold between two places, between who they were and who they will be. So, for example, Native American young men used to go off into the desert or on a mountaintop, and there were certain things that they were supposed to do. They were leaving their childhood behind, but they were not quite adults. But while they were there in this liminal stage, they went through certain things that when they came out of them, then they would be an adult. Another example of liminality is that time between daylight and darkness, between full light and dark. It's not quite dusk. It's that time when you look, you can see the difference between a person and a tree, but you might not be able to see who that person is. It just lasts for a second, or maybe a minute. I've never timed it, but it doesn't last long. But you know when it's past that it happened. That's the liminal stage. I think that was what was happening with Peter and James and John. They were leaving the relationship that they had with Jesus behind them as they walked up the mountain with him. They leave behind everything they knew and understood. Not that they're not going to remember it, they take it with them into this time. But this is going to shape how they understand those things now. How they understand what it meant that he fed the crowds and that he healed the sick. They're no longer the same fearful disciples they were before. They're not the same as those ones that woke Jesus up afraid of the storm and asked him to save them. They climbed the mountain now, wondering what it was that Jesus meant by what he just said, which was, if you want to follow me, take up your cross. You must lose your life in order to save it. So they're going up the mountain, as these disciples, confused, trying to make sense of what Jesus has told them. And then on the mountaintop, Peter, James, and John are in that threshold space, the liminal space between past and future, between who they were and who they will become, in between hopelessly confused disciples and the fearless witnesses to Jesus' resurrection that will one day change the world. They're not totally in the dark after seeing Jesus transfigured, shining, radiating his true nature, the godness, shining through his humanity. But they still can't quite make out what that means, what this godness in human form means. This time for us, following Epiphany, not quite Lent, is a kind of liminality, a threshold. We've seen Jesus revealed to the world as Messiah of all people, not quite the Messiah we expected, but probably the Messiah we need. We're not quite sure we're headed. We're not all the way to Easter and resurrection, but we're on our way. Now we've seen a glimpse of God in Jesus, we can walk into Lent even with ashes on our forehead, bearing our crosses, knowing we don't walk in despair. There is that light we can't quite forget, the light that somehow not only transfigured and changed Jesus, but having seen that, we too are changed. We're no longer confused disciples, but people on the way with Jesus. We still have to bear our crosses. We still have to wear the ashes and walk with Jesus to Jerusalem and all that holds. We know we will be faithless, but now that we've seen the light, we can't go back and live in darkness. Of course, human transformation tends to be much less dramatic than Jesus' transfiguration. It's less mountaintop and more street level, less about God revealing God in us and more about revealing what God can do in us. I think a really good example of that is addicts and how they can reveal what that transformation looks like and what God can accomplish. You probably all know someone controlled by addiction to whatever, drugs, alcohol, and that addiction becomes a kind of transformation. They become people without hope, people without choices, without a future, sometimes unrecognizable to those who love them. But a different and even more powerful transformation happens when an addict overcomes their addiction. I once met a man who described it so eloquently and simply. He said he was describing his perfect day that he just experienced. He said he had a few good months of sobriety. He'd been sober for a few years. It had been tough. He had his ups and downs. He had relapses. And he had a lot of struggle with that. But he said his perfect day had come one day when he came home from work. He opened his door to his apartment and just stood there. He didn't know what to do. He had the whole evening ahead of him. He could make choices about how he would spend that evening. He said he'd spent years of his life knowing when he got home exactly what he would be doing for the next 8 to 12 hours. He would be drinking. An evening in which he had choices, where there was possibility, where there was hope, for him, that was perfection. His was a transformed life. And as he spoke, as he was just telling us this simple story, he almost shone with what looked like humble gratitude that his life had been given back to him. Jesus' transfiguration, the revelation that he was not only man but also God, was an act of transformation for the disciples. The voice from the cloud wasn't speaking to Jesus, it was speaking to them. This is my son, the chosen. Listen to him. Jesus' appearance, radiating with the glory of God, is not for Jesus' sake, it's for the disciples. The transfiguration was a liminal moment shaping them into the disciples they needed to be. It's not complete when they come down from the mountain. Just before this mountaintop revelation, Jesus told the disciples what lay ahead in Jerusalem. He told them he was walking to his death, and he told him that if they were coming with him, that they would have to embrace suffering as well. They still have to take that walk. They'll still be confused at times. They'll certainly be faithless, betraying Jesus, running away at his greatest time of need. But maybe this vision of Jesus' true nature, of Jesus as God shining through, was the only way they were able to get through it at all. Maybe without this vision, they would have just turned around, went home, and taken up fishing again. Our call to discipleship is a call to live in the glory of the presence of God, but in God's strange logic. While that glory may be found in glimpses on the mountaintop, it's more often found in suffering, in our suffering, or walking with others in their suffering. Just as Jesus' glory was most clearly present in the death and resurrection of Jesus. We live in this in-between time, in this liminality, catching glimpses of the holy while still walking in darkness a lot of the time. We'd like to move from glory to glory, mountaintop to mountaintop. There's a poem by a man named Wilbur Reese. He calls this wanting to live from mountaintop to mountaintop called Buying $3 Worth of God. His poem is called Buying $3 Worth of God, and it goes like this. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Not enough to explode my soul and disturb my sleep. Not enough to take control of my life. I just want enough to equal a cup of warm milk. Just enough to ease some of the pain from my guilt. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. I would like to find a love that is pocket-sized. I don't want enough of God to make me love a black man or pick beads with a migrant. Not enough to change my heart. I can only stand just enough to take to church when I have the time. Just enough to equal a snooze in the sunshine. I want ecstasy, but not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, but not a new birth. I would like to purchase a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. And if it doesn't work, I'd like to get my money back. I'd like to buy $3 worth of God, please. I'd like to hide some for a rainy day. Not enough for people to see a change in me. Not enough to impose on my responsibility. Just enough to make folks think I'm okay. Could I just get $3 worth of God, please? Well, with $3 worth of God, we can skim across the mountaintops. We don't have to sink our roots into the suffering that Jesus says make us his disciples. He says our life is off of the mountaintop, on the way, carrying our cross to Jerusalem, to death, to resurrection. At this intersection of Epiphany and Lent, we turn away from our gaze on Jesus as a baby, true God and true man, to Jesus who chooses death on the cross as the expression of God's love, of God's power. Jesus who invites us to take up our cross and follow him on that path. On that path with Jesus, we never forget the glimpse we had of the indescribable glory of God. This is no ordinary man we follow. This is no human journey. Only those who trust Jesus can do this. And we are so bad at trusting. We know this. So each day we get up. We rise in Christ. We lean on our baptism. We confess again and again how it is that we try to run our lives. We ask forgiveness for our stubbornness. Like the recovering alcoholic, we live in humble gratitude every day that our lives have been transformed. We do this again and again and again together. Our walk with Jesus toward Easter begins with taking up our cross, a concept so foreign to us that we have to practice it over and over again. We begin again by trying to understand what it means that we are dust, and to dust we shall return, receiving that dusty cross on our brow on Wednesday. Please stand.